Our speaker is genuinely superbly equipped. He's been to Yale, he's been to Columbia, he's been to London School of Economics. He's written 5 books, mostly on the subject of Russia. He has been the Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post. He's even taught in North Carolina. At the moment, he is that supreme godhead of all newspapers, the managing editor of the Washington Post. He's going to speak to us on prospects for the new Russia. I'm delighted to introduce Bob Kaiser.
Thanks very much. I'm flattered by the size of this gathering. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't expect so many of you. I guess maybe the subject has something to do with it, since I know, unfortunately, we're still not offering home delivery in Baltimore. Not that I wouldn't like to. It occurred to me, thinking about what I'd say tonight, that it's a measure of how fast things are changing and how far we've come just since last August, or a year ago August, the failed coup, that it's already possible to start telling some of the old Soviet-era jokes again. Particularly one of my favorites about the difference between a pessimist and an optimist. The pessimist is the guy who says things will get worse. The optimist is the one who says things can't get worse. And I suppose there's some of that going on in Moscow tonight. We didn't know, Dr. Bird and I, how opportune the timing was going to be when we agreed that I'd speak on the last day of November. But as you know, tomorrow now, the Congress of People's Deputies, one of the many anachronisms of the new Russia, a legislative body elected in 1990 and on a different planet almost, filled with former communists and apparatchiks of the old regime, convenes in Moscow in a meeting which, when it was conceived of a few months ago, was seen by many of the members of this body as a great opportunity to dump Yeltsin and his government. I will predict boldly tonight, knowing that I'll be out of town tomorrow, that this won't happen. I'm not sure what will happen. We can talk about that, and if you have some questions, I'll be glad to try to deal with them later. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I'm extraordinarily impressed with Yeltsin's political resourcefulness and the steps he's taken to neutralize his opponents. But nevertheless, it is another dramatic turning point, and a bit of a nervous one, in a situation that I think is going to continue more or less like this for many years to come, a decade probably, a decade of walking on eggs. We might as well get used to it. This isn't going to get cleared up quickly. Americans aren't very good at patience, not one of our national characteristics, but we're going to have to be patient because this is a very big mess in a very big country, and it's just not going to get fixed quickly. The hardest thing for me, and I suspect for lots of us in this room, is to come to grips with the experience of living through revolutionary moments. There may be a couple of old folks here who lived through the 1917 period, but most of us haven't seen anything like this, and I do think it's comparable. I think for sure that the years we're living through right now will be the subject of scores, hundreds of books in the 21st century, if of course there are books in the 21st century. And that we are really undergoing an extraordinary change in the world, and yet the normal human thing for us to do, particularly we spoiled, fat and sassy Americans, is to worry about this summer's vacation and tomorrow's roast chicken, and not really to think or to come to grips with what we're watching. It's very hard to do. It's very hard from my chair over at the Post to try to put this into a newspaper every day in a way that rises to the moment. The fact is that the forms of journalism that we practice are suited to a kind of conventional ebb and flow of events, and it's very hard to put a label on a story that says, you know, this is not ordinary, this one is historic, start here. But that's what's happening. And certainly we all caught on to that in 1889 and 1990 as we watched communism crumble. And yet we still, I know it, I predict we'll see it again tonight from the questions I'm asked here. It happens every time I appear in public and talk about these subjects. What we want to know is, will Yeltsin last, and what will happen next month, and lots of questions which, if we're lucky enough to live through this and be able to look back on it, will seem very small indeed, because in fact, one of the characteristics of this moment is that it's a transitionary period. It's not yet, in my opinion, the beginning of anything that the residents of Russia in 2050, say, will recognize as part of the continuum they're living in then. No, we're still coming out of the communist period. All the key figures, virtually, beginning with Yeltsin himself, our former communist officials. Mr. Gaidar is an interesting exception, a very young man and a departure in a way. But in fact, the makers of the real new Russia are not going to be former officials of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. They're going to be something else. I'm not sure what. We're in the midst of something revolutionary, literally. We're in the midst of something very rocky and exciting and dramatic. The prospects, I thought about this on the train coming over, the prospects for steady, smooth transformation for Russia into some new modern state, the prospects for that, I say with absolute confidence, are zero. It will not be smooth, it will not be steady, it will not be recognizable 10 years from now, what we see today, and vice versa. So let's get used to that idea. It's going to be tough and tricky. I thought I'd talk first a little bit about where we're coming from. And then I knew I'd talk first about that when I was told that this show may go on C-SPAN and I could sell a few books on the subject of where we're coming from. Because I did publish a book last year about Gorbachev called Why Gorbachev Happened, of which a few copies are on sale here, and a lot more in a bookstore near you. But that's part of what's so interesting about this moment to me, is we're coming from a 7-year period. Gorbachev came to power in March 1985 and left at the end of 1991. And in those 7 years, as was just noted, the most extraordinary political, economic, social experiment of the 20th century, the thing for which the 20th century, along with Nazism, will probably be best remembered, and perhaps the atomic bomb, came a cropper. And this thing that I grew up with, that all of us in this room grew up with as our greatest fear and anxiety and source of concern, Soviet communism, disappeared, poof. It did so in this most extraordinary way, in a series of events led by a absolutely archetypal, in many respects, communist official, Mikhail Gorbachev, one of the great figures of the 20th century, I'm convinced, one of the most intriguing characters, that such a man could come out of the system and yet turn on the system, is to me one of the great stories of our time, and I tried to write it, and won't dwell a long time on it now. But think about it from the point of view of the Russians. In 1985, still, every citizen of the Soviet Union thought he or she perfectly well understood the circumstances they lived in, what they could expect from the future, what the parameters of life were. There was a very, very solid system in place on which all members of society, with a tiny, tiny number of exceptions, planned their lives, plotted their futures. It seemed to me and to most of the expert class outside, and more importantly to the overwhelming majority of Russians, like something that was going to last for a very, very long time. And within 6.5 years, it was gone. The experience of living through that was very discombobulating and particularly difficult in a society which loves order, which has always historically been very nervous about anarchy and confusion. And yet there was this period of utter anarchy and confusion. And it was a society governed by taboos. There were things that you simply couldn't talk about, things you simply couldn't say, ideas that were inadmissible, all this stuff that we all know about. But I think this is psychologically a particularly interesting experience, to live through the shattering of the governing taboos of a giant society and see all these things that could never happen, one after another. There's a wonderful quotation that one of my oldest Russian friends taught me, which I actually used as the opening quotation in my first book about Russia, published in 1976, which was from Peter the Great, who said, "Russia it's hard to translate this perfectly from the Russian, but my stab at it is this. Russia is a country in which things that just don't happen. And I think I didn't understand at all the significance of the quotation when I used it in 1976, but now we see it. The experience of the Gorbachev period was not only disorienting, it was exhausting. It was exhausting partly because, of course, it didn't get anywhere. It was a negative experience. It was a destructive experience. It was the time of tearing down the old, but as we see now with painful vividness, not a time of building the new. There is no new yet. We're just the beginnings of a new. And in fact, the conditions of life deteriorated throughout the period. They're deteriorating still. And there's, in fact, no immediate end in sight to the deterioration of general living conditions for most people in Russia. And so it was a very difficult experience. Moreover, the terms of existence in a kind of political and national sense were tossed upside down. There was this, interestingly, just today, in a hopeful decision, which I'll come back to in another context a little later. The Supreme Court, the new Supreme Court in Russia, settled the case of the lawsuit brought against Yeltsin for banning the Communist Party and declaring it illegal. And according to the first accounts that I read before leaving Washington this afternoon, it seems to be a masterful decision of balancing the various interests, because the Supreme Court decided that, yes, Yeltsin was justified in banning the Communist Party and seizing most of its property, but he wasn't justified in going so far as to prohibit the Communist Party from existing as a local political institution, and some of its property, particularly things held in the provinces that were clearly associated with the party more or less as a political party, could be kept. So they tiptoeing through the daisies came out in an interesting place. But the basic finding was, as the government argument put it, that the Communist Party wasn't a party at all, the National Party organization in Moscow. It was a state within a state. And of course it was. It was the definition of the state. There really was no state apparatus independent of the party apparatus. There was in name, but not in fact. And everyone understood, every thoughtful Soviet citizen, every knowledgeable person in the country understood that the party was the governing organization, and that if you didn't, absent the party, there was no adhesive that was holding everything together. Well, that's quite right. Now, absent the party, there is no adhesive, and things are falling apart. One of the most interesting aspects of the current situation is that Yeltsin can issue decree after decree, and he does so almost every week, but they're ignored in most of the country. People don't pay attention to presidential decrees anymore. And in fact, very different experiences are happening in, for example, the wonderfully named old city of Nizhny Novgorod, temporarily called Gorky for 60 years, now Nizhny Novgorod again. They've got a very active local government doing real private enterprise, selling off every shop in the city, and lots of interesting initiatives going on there. Whereas in Yaroslavl, for example, very little progress has been made toward meaningful reform. St. Petersburg is off on its own wicket, doing interesting things, some of them with reference to Moscow, many not at all, with no reference to Moscow, and so on. So not only has the system changed and the names of everything changed, but the essence of the political situation has been removed, and no new essence has been found. Now, if I can leave you with one useful thought tonight, I think, it is this. It is that 70-plus years of misrule and 50-plus years of this Stalinist system of centralized bureaucratic control of a giant country have ruined the society. This is a very hard notion to come to grips with, the idea of a ruined society. And we can talk about it for 2 hours. I won't do that, but if you want to talk about it some more in the question period, don't hesitate. But let me give you a little outline of what I mean by a ruined society. There is no sense, coming out of the Soviet period, there is no sense of civic responsibility in Russia. There is now the beginnings of a new civic sensibility, a new feeling in lots of parts of the country that people are actually responsible for what happens in their communities and their neighborhoods. This is all utterly new since the late 80s. Before that, the communist system had stamped out any sense of responsibility for affairs, for life, for the governance. Think about this. It's a hard notion because our whole system and society are based on civic responsibility at almost every level, starting with the condominium association setting the fees, going right up to the Federal Trade Commission arguing over, or the Food and Drug Administration over how to label beef. There's all sorts of responsibility in our society. There's none. The only responsible organisms were those that were doing the party's bidding, the party itself, the KGB, and so on. To try to instill in a society of 150 million souls now a sense of civic responsibility is going to be an extraordinary effort. Workers in Russia, alas, don't know how to work. Ask anybody you know, I'm sure there's some here tonight who tried to do business in the old Soviet Union or the new Russia. The hardest problem is to get the working class, the proletariat, to work. The old joke was, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. It was true. It was absolutely true. And the basic notion of putting in 8 good hours, not to say 9 or 10, is simply foreign to 90% or more of the Russian workforce. Interestingly, intriguingly, I was there in March for 10 days. I got to see this. It was a thrilling and exciting thing to see. Those who figured out how to exploit the new opportunities are working very hard. They're a tiny fraction of the whole. Managers don't know how to manage. Because they weren't asked to manage. They were asked to fulfill plans. They were given instructions. They were given norms. You will this month produce so many tons of steel, and this year so many more. The inputs were provided. The outputs were bought before they were made. It was a kind of presiding function. Now, a manager of an enterprise has to fend for himself. He's got to find supplies. He's got to find customers. He's got to maintain a workforce and do things that managers do. But he has no experience of how to do this. And very little training. There is now a big new phenomenon of business schools and foreigners teaching business and so on. It's something we can help with, but it's a very hard notion. Third critical economic aspect of a ruined society, no money. It's now becoming vivid as the price of the ruble falls from a penny each to 100 to $1 to now 500 to $1. Who knows where it's going to go? When I lived in Moscow in 1971 to 4, I had to pay $1.05 for a ruble. It was a totally arbitrary administered figure. But the fact is that not only is there no money of value, there's no banking system. There is no such thing in Russia as a check for a human person, ordinary person to write and settle a debt with. There's no such thing as a credit card, and so on. So building a free market economy, the wonderful phrase that we use to describe this, if you start thinking about what you really need to make a free market economy work, it's staggering. There's no business law structure. There's no method for enforcing contracts. There isn't even a recognized form of contracts. There's no decision yet about who has jurisdiction over contracts, localities, cities, provinces, whatever. So all the basic tools that are so important to our kind of economic activity are absent. Maybe worse, there's no legal structure worth a nickel or a ruble. There are courts, luckily, and police forces that still function to some degree, and today's wonderful decision shows that there's plenty of room for creative exercise of legal thinking, but the whole idea of turning to a court system as an independent arbiter of disputes or a protector of rights, or things of that kind, completely new idea. They get it, they understand it. Smart people have been working on this for a long time, but they don't have it, and it's going to be a long time coming. All sorts of institutions that we take for granted, I guess I've already made that clear, are absent. And institutions like this one, which are so helpful in bringing the world into a city like Baltimore, independent universities that are genuinely independent, thriving centers of learning that are making their own decisions about how to organize themselves and what to teach and so on. All these things have got to be invented or reinvented in a new way, and this will take a long time too. Politics, of course, something that we don't always like the way it works in our society, but at least it does keep working. And we somehow, angry as we may get with it, we continue to respect the results of the process. There's no sense of politics in that way in Russia yet. And it's extraordinary to me how much deference there has been, particularly to election results. Probably the most important event in the whole Gorbachev era, to me, looking back over the dynamic of it, besides Gorbachev's own decision in the beginning to start telling the truth and dealing honestly with problems, was Yeltsin's victory in April 1990, I guess I can't keep these dates right, when he ran for the Congress of People's Deputies from the biggest constituency in the country in Moscow and won by 90%. And Gorbachev had chickened out of running himself and had accepted one of the 100 places that were reserved for Communist Party officials. And suddenly everybody woke up the next day and realized, in a sort of by a weird societal osmosis, that Yeltsin was a legitimate political leader for whom 6 million people had voted. And nobody had voted for Gorbachev. And to me, that was the beginning of the end for Gorbachev. So there is this respect for the impact of the political process, if you will. And there is a very effective, if crude, understanding of political legitimacy, which is indeed Yeltsin's strongest card today. He is the only legitimate national figure. But the whole panoply of politics, anything you can think of that's part of our politics, is new to Russia or absent in Russia, and will take a long time to come to pass. Then there's this whole realm of things about how the understanding about how the world works, which Russians, unfortunately, no fault of their own, don't have. I've explained to 2 dozen Russians over the years how a checking account works, and every time you get these wide eyes. You mean to say the guy trusts you that that little piece of paper is as good as money? Well, yes. In so many different respects, because of this extraordinarily paternalistic and centralized and organized system that they all grew up under, the idea of autonomous behavior, people completely independently of any larger authority, any central control, just doing things for themselves, is both new and terrifying to lots of Russians. And so on. I can go on for hours about this, one of my favorite subjects. But I hope I've given you a glimpse of my ruined society. You just can't expect anything successful, anything comparable to our world, anything modern, to jump up into existence there in a matter of a few years. It can't happen. So much has to come first. One of the most tragic aspects, and you now can read stories periodically in our press about this, is what's happened in the countryside. It seemed to make all the sense in the world. It just has happened very effectively in China, for example, that you could privatize the countryside, let farmers go back to taking care of their own little plot of land, and prospering and profiting from the sale of what they can grow on it. A perfectly sensible idea, which 60 or 80% of the collective farmers in Russia are bitterly opposing today. They don't want their own piece of land. They have no idea how to take care of their own piece of land. The whole notion of managing a piece of land from season to season, planting, harvesting, burying the crops, and so on. This is meaningless to the average person working on a collective farm. Who is the average person working on a collective farm? A woman of 55 or 60. That's who it is. And she doesn't want any part of that kind of responsibility. And this again is a function of the 60 years, 50 years of misrule. The men looked for jobs with status, party officials, mechanics in the tractor station, taking care of their tractors, etc. So very few of the men in large parts of the country ever engaged in farming per se. They managed, they made decisions, they gave orders, but the women went out and did the work. And now the men are terrified that they might be told to take care of some land. They don't know what to do. There's so many problems of this kind, and it's going to be so hard to deal with. So how will disaster be averted? Well, it may not be. Disaster is one of the possibilities, and we got to face up to it. It is possible that there will be famine. It is possible that there will be enormous social dislocation. It is possible that groups will start shooting at each other, just as they're doing in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. I actually don't expect these things to happen now. I may be Pollyanna about it. I'll tell you why, a few reasons why in a few moments. But it certainly is possible. And to pretend that it isn't would be to engage in romantic self-deceptions. So why might these catastrophes be averted? First of all, because this is Russia, an absolutely fabulous country, filled with absolutely fabulous, talented, creative people. It is not a coincidence that all those creative giants came out of Russia in the 19th century, writers, composers, and so on. This is an extraordinarily rich culture. There is no more attractive, more interesting, more intelligent, better educated group than what the Russians call their intelligentsia. Unfortunately, there are an awful lot of them in Baltimore tonight, and in Washington, and in Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem, and Paris, and a lot of other places other than Russia, because they've been driven out in the 60s and 70s, and because a lot of them have fled in recent years simply to make a go of it for themselves and their families. But still left behind, there are many hundreds of thousands, millions of extremely bright and talented people. And I have a lot of confidence that this is not a third world country. On the contrary, it's a country with a fabulous intellectual, cultural, and moral tradition even, that will produce lots of surprising people, as it has already. Some of the absolutely splendid young people who have come into their own, such as the 32-year-old who's running the experiments in Nizhny Novgorod, are just remarkable and a source of great hope to me. Another thing that is probably my single greatest surprise living through this whole last period of 7 or 8 years is the emergence of what is palpably a democratic spirit. The greatest physical change in Moscow, in my opinion, is actually in the looks on people's faces. One of the things that just stunned me as a young man living there in 71 to 74 was the beaten downedness of the ordinary person on the street. You just saw defeated faces, hunched over, even in body language. I quoted in my first book about Russia a wonderful Pushkin poem, which was an expression of Pushkin's exasperation with the Russian peasants who were then slaves when he wrote his poem, with a wonderful first line, "Graze on, ye sleeping sheep and cattle." And that indeed was the feeling we had about the great Russian masses. And now you see a sense of personal sovereignty in people's faces and in their body language that just completely took me by surprise when I first saw it, starting in about 1988, and which is now very palpable. You've got now a whole younger generation, everybody under 25, really thinks that telling the truth about history or traveling to the West or having Russian rock music bands on television is sort of normal. All of that was quite revolutionary for anybody who's over 30. But this younger generation, which is catching on very fast, has adapted very fast to the possibilities of the new order. And they're an exciting group. And all over the country, we've seen people starting when the first local elections began in 1988, we've seen people stand up and say, I want to run for office, I'll take care of that, I'll do this job. All gestures of reaching for responsibility that seemed absolutely counterindicated to those of us who thought we understood the political and sociological culture of the old Soviet Union. There's a wonderful free press in Russia, very exciting to those of us who practice this realm. Gutsy, smart, tough-minded, and genuinely independent. And they are holding accountable the people that hold the power in the society in the best possible way. Even lawyers have turned out to be able to play a positive role. That was meant to be a joke here. I suspect there are a few of them in the room. But it's marvelous. Here's this downtrodden profession really treated like dirt in the old system, and constantly subjected to the arbitrary decisions of authority that had nothing to do with ordinary legal practice or fair play or anything like that. Suddenly given a chance to operate on their own, and they are operating, and they're doing good things. And this interesting Supreme Court decision today was a good example of that. There is, of course, in Russia great national wealth, which sets the country apart from most others on the globe. And this, too, is very much a saving grace. It's been horribly abused. The ecological damage done to Russia is a nightmare. There's a wonderful new book by Murray Feshbach and Alfred Friendly on this subject, which I recommend to anybody who's interested. Ecocide, I think it's called, in Russia. But it's absolutely tragic, and we keep learning new details of the destruction of the natural wealth and the natural resources of the country every month. And yet, there still is huge reserves of oil and gas and gold and diamonds. There's a very rich agricultural base, or ought to be. There's timber that will never be able to be fully exploited, and so on. And this will be a huge advantage. There's Russian pride, which can be a source of danger, certainly, because a lot of the darkest personalities on the scene now, the new Russian fascists, who I think really are fascists and very scary people, they too are a product of Russian pride, but certainly not the only product. And I think they are a proud people, and that's much better than being a self-contemptuous people or a profoundly uncertain, insecure people. The Russians believe in themselves. They believe in their national mission in senses that can be dangerous, but also can be very positive. And I think it's an advantage they've got here. Then they've got some luck going just now. Gorbachev represented luck, in my opinion. The idea that the communist system could find within itself exactly the right figure to end the nightmare and to bring this crazy experiment to a close. It was a lot of things. It was history, it was psychology, but it was luck too. And it was a near thing as well. Gorbachev might never have made it, might easily never have made it. One of the things we know about Gorbachev now, which intrigues me most, is the contempt with which he himself held the whole system from the time he was 21 years old. I digress for a moment about this in hopes of selling a few more books, but there's an interesting moment in Gorbachev's biography where he leaves Moscow State University. He studied law, by the way, which turned out to be a very good thing, because I think as a law student he got to read a lot of Western political a lot of constitutions and political thought and history that helped make him this extraordinary historical figure that he was. In fact, there were a whole series of interesting coincidences in his life which allowed him to see the difference between the real world and the mythological world of Stalinist propaganda. Anyway, he meets Raisa at the university. They get married, but she's got a year to go, and he's got to go home to the Stavropol region where he grew up, where apparently, this still isn't clear in the record, but apparently he had a deal that the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, agreed to sponsor him and send him to Moscow State University if he agreed to come back and work for them afterwards. And in any case, he did go back, which was a hard thing to do, and became a junior official in the Komsomol back in this little town from which he came, which had to be a terrible blow to his self-esteem and just his sense of his place in the world, having had 5 exotic years in Moscow and met a lot of sophisticated people and gotten married and so on, and to have to come home was hard. He wrote a letter to Raisa, which she prints in her book, which came out last year, which I'm sorry, I should have written down the quotation. It's a fascinating little, just a paragraph. But what he writes, in effect, is, you wouldn't believe the pomposity of the people I got to work with out here, these stuffed shirts who walk around like they're little kings of the universe, and they're just these petty little officials who don't know what they're doing. That's the gist of the message. Now the bad news. There was a lifetime of letters from Gorbachev to Raisa, probably of this kind, I don't know. She burned them all in September 1990 after the coup. This is more proof that you can't trust history to those who make it. And just an incredible tragedy to me, because this was the only record probably we'd ever have had of how Gorbachev felt about things contemporaneously. And now, unfortunately, he can sit there and write his own memoirs, which will, I fear, be no better than most such memoirs, very self-justifying and self-explaining and not very helpful. And alas, these letters are gone. That's a digression. But what's interesting to me is the good luck that the Russians had in finding him. And now they found one, and now they found a second. Yeltsin certainly represents at least as good luck as Gorbachev, and he's even more improbable. He didn't have any of the benefits that Gorbachev had of education and experience. For example, the Gorbachevs in 1967 got to spend a month in France and had a Renault of their own, which was rented for them, and they drove around France by themselves for 30 days and saw a vibrant Western society on their own. This is a time when he was the first party secretary in the Stavropol region in the Boondocks. A mind-blowing experience for Gorbachev, one of many, but I'll leave that alone now. But Yeltsin grew up in Siberia, in Sverdlovsk, Yekaterinburg, as it was and now is again, and saw none of the world, had an engineering school education, a Kalos Institute of Construction. He's never read any books that I'm aware of, and doesn't pretend to. I mean, he's a very ordinary, very shrewd politico with a lot of good instincts, but has turned out to be exactly the right figure, in my opinion, for this particular phase of the transition. And if this sort of luck can continue just for another 5 or 10 years, maybe they can get through all this. But so much can go wrong. And I started to make a list, making notes for tonight about all the things that go wrong, and I got all depressed again, rejoined the pessimists. This inflation that you're reading about now, the danger of hyperinflation, is clearly very real. And that will it's already terrified people to see the price of bread go from 17 kopecks a loaf, that is 17 1/100ths of a ruble, to 30 rubles. Which has happened, and the old pensioners who were supposedly living on 70 rubles a month, now 500, still are supposed to spend 30 rubles for a loaf of bread, and so on. It's already completely disorienting, but it can get a lot worse. The ethnic problem is very big, and it's astounding to me that it's gone as well as it has so far. There are 25 million or more, probably more, Russians, ethnic Russians, who no longer live in Russia. They live in Lithuania or Armenia or Kazakhstan or some other place. They're spread out all over the country. That's 25 million outside of Russia and only 150 million inside. So a huge number of people, absolutely unproportionally. And some of them are in really dicey situations. In Latvia, for example, where the population is just about half Russian, but the new government is in the control of the Latvians. The Latvian government has decided that they won't allow any of these Russians to become voting citizens, and they're really treating them badly. It's perfectly understandable in a historical context, but perfectly wrong, I would argue, in a contemporary context, and a real source of danger, I think, because there are still some number of divisions, I've forgotten the number, 4 or 5 probably, of Russian troops, Soviet troops, as they once were, stationed in Latvia, and seeing their own neighbors and relatives and so on mistreated by the local government. That's a very dicey situation. It's just one of many. There's this astounding problem of the nuclear reactors. Chernobyl is back in operation, amazingly. One of the 3 plants there that have been closed down because the Ukrainians don't have any electric power, and they had to restart it. There are 19 Chernobyl-type graphite-controlled reactors operating in the country today, not just in Russia, also in some of the old republics. Every one of those is a powder keg. There could be a terrible accident tomorrow. And a little bit is being done. The neighbors, particularly the Scandinavians, are working very hard with the people that are running the plants nearest to Scandinavia. And now the Europeans are very nervous about the ones in the south, and they're trying to get things done there to train the operators and things of that kind. But the basic fact is that this is a very unsafe design, and all capable of having terrible accident at any time. And of course, there's this great political turmoil. There is some danger, I don't think too much myself, but I can be wrong, of another putsch, another coup attempt. I think Yeltsin's biggest advantage today is that there is no serious pretender to the throne. There is nobody who really wants the responsibility of running the country. And I guess after what I've said tonight, you can understand why. But I think lots of people want to push Yeltsin in their direction, and others will want to push him off the direction he's on now. But nobody yet, no formidable figure, has had the nerve to stand up and say, let me do it. And I think this will continue probably because doing it is now so dicey. The easiest dream to encounter, I presume still, certainly last summer or spring when I was there, on the streets is a kind of nostalgic dream that, oh, order could be restored the way it used to be. But the old order was based on the effective operation of the system of central control. And that system is simply broken down. The strings that used to pull from Moscow to make things happen elsewhere have broken. They're ripped. They're gone. And so regardless of what the attitude is of the people in the center, anyone who tries to pull one of those strings is going to find nothing on the other end. And I think they understand that now. And that's a disincentive to a new coup. But lots of crazy things can happen. And the Weimar Republic parallel isn't a bad one. It is possible that this is the Russian Weimar and that there'd be some Hitler-esque solution to the problem at the end of it. I say I don't expect that, but I certainly can't rule it out. And I guess the reason I insist on continuing to be optimistic is that we've lived through so many impossibles already, at least impossibles by the lights of the community of Sovietologists that I used to be part of. We've all now lost the subject that we used to be experts in, and as you may notice tonight, we're sort of flailing around for new handles. But my list of impossibles, we've seen the end of communism. We've seen the birth of a free Russian spirit. We have seen the flowering of free enterprise. 20 or 25% of Russian workers now work for private enterprises. That's a startling figure, and it's doubled in the last 9 months, probably. We've seen the successful end of the central control system, but still farmers growing food, people having something to eat, and life going on. Indeed, it was stunning to me walking around free Moscow in March to see all the little things that were working fine. The streetcars are running, the subways are running. People were selling flowers in the metro stations. To me, that's somehow a very heartening example. I don't pretend to be an economist. I don't understand enough about these things. But if people were paying 25 rubles, which was then 25 cents at the official rate of exchange, but also 2 or 3 days' pay for 5 blossoms of chrysanthemums in March. It seems to me that that's evidence that people still have spirit and hope and a romantic appreciation for some of the right things. So I'm not giving up on them, but I'm sure not clear in my own mind how they're going to make it yet either. Thank you very much.
The floor is open for questions until 10 minutes after 7. Yes, sir.
Mr. Kaiser, when you spoke about the Baltic states, you made a statement that the Russian government or the Russian army might not like the fact if their compatriots or Russians in the Baltic states are mistreated by the local governments. Now, when we say that, we have to keep in mind that these people you're talking about came in there after the countries were occupied by Soviet armies by force and were brought in there as colonists, just like during Hitler's time, Germans were brought into Poland. Now, is it too much to ask from people who came in such a manner to follow legal proceedings, to apply for citizenship before they are declared citizens? Now, in Estonia, for instance, in a period of 6 months, there was where citizenship could be applied for, even without waiting for a 2-year period of being a permanent resident. Only 6,000 non-Estonians that had come into Estonia from the Soviet Union applied. And most of them, others, about 70,000 or 80,000 applied for Russian citizenship while living in Estonia. Now, this gives you a little better picture here. So there's really no mistreatment. In Estonia, the 2-year waiting period for citizenship is probably the most liberal in the world and more liberal than the United States. Thank you.
I know all these points, of course, and I understand your feelings. I just think as a practical matter, a lot of those Russians who arrived brutally, I understand, and did brutal things too, or their forebears, but a lot of them came 55 years ago, or 52 years ago. And, you know, there 2 or 3 generations in some Russian families have grown up in Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. And regardless of what you and I understand about how they got there and why, to them it's home. They've been there for a long time. And I just think it makes it a very dicey political situation. I'm not trying to pass a moral judgment here. I just think as a practical matter, it's very difficult.
Yes, sir, at the microphone.
Thank you. Over the past 50 years or so, a dominant factor in the Russian foreign relationships have been its attitude toward Germany and keeping it divided. I wonder if you could comment on who's making foreign policy now and what their attitude is toward the unified Germany.
Who's making foreign policy now is a good and important question. The marvelous young man, Andrei Kozyrev, who's the foreign minister, has become one of the most controversial figures in Moscow. The conservatives hate him. They accuse him of selling out the honor of the fatherland and so on. But he is still the foreign minister, and in an operational sense, he is still making foreign policy with Yeltsin's support. In fact, very little foreign policy is being made. They're stymied on all the hard ones. The best evidence of this being Yeltsin's cancellation of his trip to Japan a couple of months ago, because he knew that he couldn't tell the Japanese, for domestic political reasons, he couldn't tell them what he himself would like to tell them and what they wanted to hear, which is that they'll get the Kuril Islands back. So he canceled the trip instead of having to go and argue with them. The German question seems to be not a big issue, fascinatingly. There is no, that I'm aware of, I'm not in intimate touch anymore, but I'm not aware of any loud political argument in Moscow today that says that there's a German threat to Russia or that there's a German problem. The German problem is that there are still all those soldiers living in East Germany, but in fact the Germans are being very generous about building housing for them when they come back and so on. But that doesn't mean that a new nirvana has been reached in Russian-German relations. I agree with your point that historically this is a very difficult and complicated European relationship, and I expect it to be difficult and complicated again in the future. But just for now, it seems to be relatively calmed down.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
How do Russians, specifically the government, view the United States today?
The question is, how do Russians and the government in particular view the United States today?
The Russians have a wonderful term, which is the right answer to that question, which roughly translates as variously. There is an enormously ambivalent relationship. There has been all through this Cold War period, and now it's very vivid now in a new way. There is a loud, audible body of opinion accusing Yeltsin and Kozyrev of selling out to the United States, making them a second-rate power already. The new arms control agreement that Bush and Yeltsin initialed in principle, it's sort of an outline agreement called START II. I confess, personally, I thought it was a bad idea because it took too much away from the Russians. I think Yeltsin approved it in a moment when he was desperate for Bush's help and support. What it said at the bottom line was that the Russians couldn't have any more land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles and must follow us by putting most of their missiles at sea. That's fine in principle. It's a good idea in terms of nuclear doctrine, but as a practical matter, it would require the Russians to make enormous expenditures on weapons of no utility, hopefully, and they're just not going to do it. So we're going to have to find a different way to allow them to preserve their dignity and some of their nuclear deterrent on land, I think. We'll all see that happen over time. But we are what Russians always wanted to be, except that it's not what we really are that they wanted to be, it's what they thought we were that they wanted to be. And therefore, it's very much that kind of a love-hate situation. I think it gets increasingly painful as they come to grips with the fact that their previous status was really totally artificial. and unearned in some fundamental way. And the rowing back now and accepting second or third class status in the world is just going to be really hard, and it's going to show up in relations with us and with others too.
Mr. Sherman?
Thank you for your comments. You would be interested to know that very few people seem to be dozing off tonight. Also, thank you for the Washington Post, even though I had to put 70 cents in to get one of them today out of a machine on Pratt Street. Now, to the question.
But think what a bargain it is. I mean, a quart of milk.
It really comes out 35 cents when it works right out of the machine. We saw a friend of ours off in the Peace Corps of 100 Americans that went to Russia. And my question is, how can Americans help? And what do you see the government of the United States doing to help Russia, if I can be so presumptuous as to think that our help is wanted? And how can it happen? And where's the money coming from in the climate that we're in if the American people even want it to happen? That's the question.
Thank you. This is a huge subject, and I won't try to do it full justice. It occurred to me, riding over here in the train, one of the reasons we got through the Cold War, one of them, there are lots of them, without it becoming hot, was the fact that we really had been allies with the Russians in World War II. I kept meeting Russians all through my time there who wanted to ask me about Studebakers and Spam and all this stuff from Lend-Lease, which they remembered with the greatest warmth and affection and appreciation. And I think it was very hard for Russians of that generation to actually think of blowing up America. It didn't make any sense to a lot of them. We have somehow got to establish that kind of a relationship again with this new generation. And we've got to hope that Russians 50 years from now will look back and say, oh, in those horrible times in the 90s, the Americans and the French and the British and the Germans and so on helped us get through. There's an enormous amount we can do, very little of which we're now doing. I actually think the Peace Corps and many related ideas for genuine technical assistance on the ground is very promising. The New York Federal Reserve Bank has got a really good little exchange going on with the Ministry of Finance and the government in Moscow to try to teach them about money supply and monetary policy. One of the thoughts that occurred to me is you could create a wonderful band of retired American bankers who could go over and try to help them create independent banks. Not S&L's, banks, right? But that sort of very practical assistance is something they need and they're hungry for. They're absolutely very hungry for it. And then we're just going to have to be available as providers of last resort for lots of things that allow them to just hold together as a cohesive society. And that's going to include money, and we're going to have to find the money as we have. We're going to have to find more of it.
Yes, sir, at the microphone. Sir.
Would you agree that in the Soviet Union and in Russia today, that socialism, in the Marxian sense, has never been applied?
I would, although, to be fair to Marx, I'm not sure he had any ideas for how to run a country of that kind. On the contrary, he had analytical tools and explanations, but he never offered a blueprint, and that showed, certainly. But this was not anything Karl Marx would have recognized as fulfilling his dreams for society.
Yes, sir.
Maybe related to this question, do you think it is more likely that the Russian society will develop something out of it, will emerge that is different from what we came to call the Western societies, or do you think that over time they will strictly adopt what we have here? And which one of the two would you prefer?
The question is, of all the models you can imagine, how much will the Russian model of the future, potential model be like ours? And once you've stated what that model is, do you prefer it to ours or ours to theirs?
I don't know what to expect. I'm intrigued by the recent evidence from places like Sweden that thought they were on a different course of their own, and then they decided they were on the wrong course, or at least temporarily have so decided, and backed away from it. I think I do sense a great hunger in the world, and in our country too, for new techniques to mitigate the impact, the harshest impacts of the capitalist system. And yet, apart from the welfare state, that's more advanced obviously in Europe than here, but is still imperfect certainly, we haven't come up with anything terrific. And so I do expect Russians not to mimic us ultimately. They will have some Russian forms and solutions. There'll always be this wonderful Russian delusion, belief, faith, that there's something special and especially spiritual about Russia and Russians that no one else can ever understand or share. And that won't go away. I don't know how it'll manifest itself in the future, but it will be there. But, you know, already the people that were my best friends in the Russia of the 70s, who were the intellectuals, mostly the dissident intellectuals, writers and so on, they are the most alienated and scared people in Russia today. There is no place for them. They found out that they lived entirely on the beneficence of the state, and that there's in the desperate economic conditions that now exist, there's no audience for theater, there's nobody buying books, except pornography and the other new stuff that's now available. And you have a horrible feeling that this wonderful Russian tradition may really be at risk. But I'm hoping it's just sort of temporary and they'll find ways to bring it back.
I wondered if you have any comments on children and family structure, recent changes, and what you think might happen in the next few years.
The Russian family is a very powerful thing, and it has survived very well. Having children went out of fashion in the 60s and 70s and 80s. The most common family in big cities was one child. But then somewhere just before Gorbachev, in the early 80s, that started to change, and people started to have 2 and even 3 children. Very interesting foreshadowing of what was to come, I suppose, some new kind of optimism. There are terrible problems of all kinds. There are certain very specific problems that are very alarming to American sensibilities. Russians are not good about disabled kids born with handicaps. They often get sent off to orphanages as young children and never seen again. And there is a big problem in the modern era, going back now 30 years, about the children of alcoholic mothers, which are very numerous, relatively speaking. But these are not worse problems than all advanced industrial societies have seen. And I think this is not one of the biggest problems. On the contrary, multi-generational solidarity has survived so that grandparents are on the scene to help with young children, and then young children are on the scene to help with grandparents and parents as they get old. And that will certainly be a positive force in this next difficult phase.
Let me just formally thank Mr. Kaiser on behalf of a grateful audience for a most informative, very thoughtful, and thoroughly enjoyable evening. We thank you so much.